History has always carried the weight of human division. At its heart, few divisions cut deeper than those shaped by religion. For centuries, when faith and politics fuse, wars ignite that are not just about territory or resources, but about belief, identity, and destiny. In the 20th century, and into our own age, two conflicts stand out as strikingly parallel. One, fought in the streets of Belfast, Derry, and across Northern Ireland, became known as the Troubles. The other, still burning in the Middle East, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Though they are separated by geography and culture, their roots share a haunting similarity. Both wars are born from competing national identities, in which religion is not merely a private faith, but the very definition of who belongs and who does not. To understand why these conflicts erupted and why they endure, we must peel back layers of history. Both Northern Ireland and Palestine became crucibles of overlapping claims, where political aspirations collided with centuries of religious identity. Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, Jews and Muslims in Israel and Palestine. In each case, faith was never just about worship. It was a badge of community, a dividing line of history, a passport to land and legitimacy. Religion, in these stories, did not act alone, but it gave each struggle its fire, its boundaries, and its sense of righteousness. Let us begin with the Troubles. The Northern Irish conflict was not simply a quarrel between denominations about theology. Protestants and Catholics were not fighting over doctrine, but over sovereignty, power, and survival. Yet religion provided the clearest marker of allegiance. Protestants overwhelmingly identified as Unionists or Loyalists, committed to remaining part of the United Kingdom. Catholics overwhelmingly identified as Nationalists or Republicans, longing for union with the Republic of Ireland. These identities were so deeply entwined with religious affiliation that the church someone attended, the neighborhood they lived in, and the school their children went to marked them as part of one camp or the other. The roots stretched back centuries. English and Scottish Protestants had been settled in Ireland during the plantation of Ulster in the 1600s, creating a Protestant majority in the north. Catholics, dispossessed of land and marginalized by law, carried centuries of grievance. By the 20th century, when Ireland was partitioned in 1921, Northern Ireland was carved out with a Protestant majority to secure loyalty to Britain. For Catholics, this partition was a permanent wound, a symbol that their land had been divided against their will. For Protestants, partition was survival, the guarantee that they would not be absorbed into a Catholic-majority republic they feared would erase them. Religion had become the shorthand for national destiny. By the 1960s, resentment had hardened into resistance. Catholics in Northern Ireland faced systemic discrimination in housing, jobs, and political power. Peaceful civil rights marches, inspired by the American struggle, were met with violence. When protests escalated, British troops were deployed. What followed was nearly 3 decades of conflict. Bombings, assassinations, street battles, and military crackdowns. Paramilitary groups like the Irish Republican Army on the Catholic nationalist side and the Ulster Volunteer Force on the Protestant loyalist side became the dark enforcers of religious identity. Every attack deepened mistrust. Every funeral hardened divisions. In neighborhoods divided by peace walls, children grew up never knowing a friend of the other faith. Religion, here, was destiny. To be Catholic meant you were second class, fighting for rights. To be Protestant meant you were defending your very existence against erasure. Now shift to the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like the Troubles, is not reducible to religion alone. It is about territory, sovereignty, displacement, and power. But religion makes it uniquely combustible. For Jews, Israel is not just a state. It is the biblical homeland promised by God, the refuge after centuries of exile, persecution, and the Holocaust. For Muslims, Palestine is not just land. It is home to sacred cities, Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Hebron's holy sites, places woven into the faith, an identity of a people who have lived there for generations. Religion sanctifies the soil. It transforms disputes over borders into struggles of eternal significance. The 20th century remade this land. In 1948, when Israel declared independence, war erupted with surrounding Arab states. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, becoming refugees in what they remember as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Israel, for its part, secured statehood and survival, but at the cost of perpetual conflict with its neighbors and the Palestinians left under occupation or in exile. As decades passed, wars in 1967 and 1973 retro maps, but did not resolve the deeper questions. Who owns Jerusalem? Do Palestinians have a right to return? Can two nations share one land when each believes that God, history, and blood grant it to them? Religion in this conflict operates on multiple levels. On the Jewish side, it fuels the idea of a divine homeland, most powerfully expressed in religious Zionism, which views settling the land of Israel as a commandment. On the Palestinian side, Islam reinforces the sacredness of Al-Quds Jerusalem and the duty to resist occupation. Hamas, for instance, explicitly frames its struggle in Islamic terms, while other Palestinian movements have drawn more from nationalism. But even the most secular Palestinian still feels the pull of holy sites and heritage rooted in Islam and Christianity alike. Just as in Northern Ireland, religion here is the boundary line of identity. Jewish settlers and Palestinian villagers may both speak of land, but to each, that land is consecrated by God. When comparing these wars, parallels emerge sharply. Both conflicts were shaped by partition. Ireland divided in 1921. Palestine in 1947-48. Both partitions were meant to solve problems, but instead entrenched grievances. Both conflicts fused political and national identities with religious labels, making compromise harder. A Catholic family in Belfast saw their struggle not only as political, but as survival in a Protestant-dominated system. A Palestinian family in Gaza sees their struggle not only as political, but as resisting dispossession by a Jewish state they did not choose. Religion, in both, is not a debate about theology, but a marker of who you are, who you belong with, and what history you carry. And yet, religion also offered the fuel of righteousness. In Northern Ireland, Protestants often believed they were God's chosen defenders of British identity against Rome, while Catholics framed their resistance as part of a historic struggle for liberation and justice, long denied. In Israel-Palestine, each side views its cause as divinely justified. Israeli settlers believe they walk in the footsteps of Abraham. Palestinians pray in mosques that call Jerusalem the eternal capital of Islam. But while the roots may mirror each other, the arcs diverge. The Troubles, after 3 bloody decades, reached a settlement in 1998. The Good Friday Agreement. This was not peace in the sense of harmony, but a political compromise rooted in mutual recognition. Catholics and Protestants would share power, policing would be reformed, and the constitutional future of Northern Ireland would rest on consent. It was imperfect, but it worked well enough to end the daily bombings and killings. What made it possible was the gradual recognition that neither side could defeat the other, and that the world was ready to guarantee a framework of peace. Religion remained, but it was reshaped into coexistence. In Israel-Palestine, such a settlement remains elusive. Wars have flared again and again, peace talks have collapsed, and the landscape is scarred by walls, rockets, and fear. Religion makes compromise harder still. The old city of Jerusalem cannot simply be split by a line on a map. It is a single, sacred space, claimed by multiple faiths. Each side fears that yielding control of its holy places would mean erasing its identity. Unlike Northern Ireland, where religion marked identity but sacred geography was less contested, in Israel-Palestine, the land itself is holy. Every stone becomes non-negotiable. And yet, in studying these wars side by side, a sobering lesson emerges. Religion can inflame division, but it also creates the deepest longing for peace. The Good Friday Agreement was only possible when religious leaders and communities began to envision a shared future. In Israel and Palestine, many ordinary believers on both sides still cling to the hope that faith can become a bridge rather than a sword. The challenge is immense, but history shows that even wars fueled by centuries of religious division can find a path to something better. To understand how religion intensifies these conflicts, you have to look at how identity becomes inherited through faith. In Northern Ireland, Being Catholic or Protestant was rarely about belief in doctrine. It was about where you went to school, what neighborhood you lived in, who your ancestors were, and which side of history your people were on. Children were born into identities that came preloaded with fear, memory, and loyalty. In Belfast, a last name alone could expose your background. Streets were marked by flags and murals. Churches were not just places of worship. They were social anchors, cultural symbols, and reminders of centuries of division. Religion did uncreate the political divide. The political divide adopted religious labels because nothing else drew the line as clearly. In a place where jobs and houses were allocated through bias, where voting boundaries were drawn to guarantee Protestant dominance, identity had to harden to survive. Catholics, though often more religious in practice, did not fight for Catholicism as theology. They fought because being Catholic meant being excluded. Protestants, in turn, feared that any shift in power would mean losing control over their land and their future. The Bible was mentioned. Sermons were given. But the real power of religion here was belonging. You prayed on Sunday with your community, but you bled on Monday for what that community represented. The same fusion of faith and existence appears in Israel and Palestine, but shaped by different histories. For Jews, identity has always been tied to survival. After centuries of diaspora, persecution, and the Holocaust, the State of Israel became more than a political project. It was something between a miracle and a necessity. Judaism is both a religion and a people. So when Israelis defend their land, they don't just do it as citizens. They do it as a people who believe history has tested them for thousands of years. Religious texts, like the Torah, describe the land as a covenant. Even Jews who aren't religious may absorb the message that to lose this land would be to lose themselves. For Palestinians, identity is equally tied to faith, land, and memory. Islam has been interwoven into Palestinian culture for centuries, long before modern nationalism shaped the political struggle. Communities trace their history in villages, olive groves, family graves, and holy sites. Even Palestinian Christians, a minority but one with deep history, see the land as something sacred that their ancestors cared for. This is not a people that views faith as separate from identity. It is an inheritance, a language of resistance, and a reminder that they did not arrive yesterday. In both conflicts, religion also turns memory into fuel. Northern Ireland's Catholics remembered centuries of anti-Catholic laws, the Great Famine, and the partition that cut them off from the rest of Ireland. Protestants remembered the 17th century rebellions, the threat of being surrounded by Catholics, and battles like the Boyne as mythical confirmations of their destiny. Every parade, every mural, every commemoration event kept the past alive, not as history, but as obligation. In Israel, Palestine, memory is even heavier. Israelis carry the trauma of pogroms, the Holocaust, and wars for survival into every negotiation. Palestinians remember the Nakba of 1948, the loss of villages erased from the map, the refugee camps that still stand today in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank. Each side teaches its children a version of history where the other is either the threat or the used. Religion adds layers of righteousness and pain to that memory. It tells each side that the story did not begin in 1948, nor in 1967, but in ancient times when prophets walked these lands. Another similarity sits in how territory becomes non-negotiable because religion sanctifies it. In Northern Ireland, specific streets, towns, and regions became non-transferable. People would rather die than abandon their enclaves. Belfast was a patchwork of invisible lines. Catholic Falls Road and Protestant Shankill Road became icons of division. Murals painted martyrs on brick walls, and slogans marked who owned the street. The land did not belong to the broader nation in theory. It belonged to whichever community claimed it through sacrifice. But in Israel-Palestine, the sacredness of land goes even further back. Jerusalem is not just a capital. It is the spiritual center of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. The Western Wall, the Temple Mount, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, these are not just landmarks. They represent divine history. That means no peace agreement can simply redraw lines without invoking outrage. Places like Hebron, Bethlehem, Jericho, and Nablus carry biblical and Quranic weight. Every settlement, every demolition, every checkpoint feels like rewriting scripture with force. Yet despite all these parallels, there is one crucial difference that makes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even harder to resolve than the Troubles. International involvement and geopolitics magnify every step. Northern Ireland drew attention, but it was largely a localized struggle. Britain, Ireland, and eventually the United States acted as mediators, but the conflict did not pull whole regions into chaos. Israel-Palestine, by contrast, is tied into Arab nationalism, Islamic identity across the world, Western alliances, Iranian influence, and global diplomacy. Every ceasefire, every summit, every deal occurs under the pressure of international expectation and interference. Religious identity, in this context, doesn't stop at the border. It radiates into the politics of dozens of nations. Still, one of the most powerful ways religion influences both conflicts is through the idea of martyrdom. In Northern Ireland, Mura celebrated fallen fighters from the IRA and loyalist groups. Songs and stories immortalized them. Their deaths were not tragedies to be avoided. They were sacrifices for the cause. Whether the cause was union or independence, religion helped sanctify these losses as noble and necessary. In Israel-Palestine, the symbolism around martyrdom is even older and more charged. Palestinian communities, especially during the Second Intifada, memorialize those who died resisting Israeli control. On the Israeli side, soldiers who died in battles were honored not only as patriots but as defenders of a homeland promised by God. Both sides often see the fallen not as numbers, but as testimonies of faith and fate. One might ask, if religion adds so much pain to both conflicts, can it also contribute to peace? The answer, in both histories, is complicated. In Northern Ireland, some religious leaders eventually helped soften community divisions. Clergy members spoke against violence, attended funerals across lines, and slowly pushed people to imagine coexistence. But it wasn't religion alone that led to peace. It was political exhaustion, negotiation, and time. In Israel and Palestine, religious voices sometimes call for peace. Rabbis, imams, and priests have formed dialogue groups and activist networks. Yet, their influence is often overshadowed by religious hardliners who see compromise as betrayal. The tension between faith as a bridge and faith as a wall remains unresolved. Peace efforts collide with scripture, prophecy, and nationalist theology. When land is promised by God, the pen struggles to sign any treaty. Violence shaped both conflicts in ways that also show clear parallels. During the Troubles, bombings became a brutal language. Cities like Enniskillen and Omar are remembered not for their industries or landmarks, but for the bombings that took innocent lives. The IRA launched attacks not just in Northern Ireland, but in London and other British cities, trying to pressure the British government. Loyalist groups retaliated with killings of Catholic civilians. Each cycle of vengeance deepened a belief that the other side was inhuman, godless, or destined for defeat. In Israel-Palestine, violence became even more constant. Wars in 1948, 1967, 1973, 1982, and repeated Gaza conflicts have shaped generational trauma. Intifadas erupted with stone-throwing, shootings, and suicide bombings. Israeli reprisals, airstrikes, and military occupations hardened attitudes. Religion helps justify the violence, defending Holy Land, protecting God's people, avenging sacrilege. The cost is always paid by those least able to carry it. Families, children, the elderly, the displaced. One cannot talk about these conflicts without mentioning walls, both physical and psychological. In Northern Ireland, peace walls separated Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods. They were meant to protect, but instead solidified the idea that living together was impossible. Graffiti, flags, and security checkpoints turned communities into fortresses. Children grew up without ever speaking to someone of the other religion, even if they lived only a few streets apart. In Israel-Palestine, the separation barrier in the West Bank stands as one of the most visible symbols of division. Israelis call it a security fence that prevents terrorist attacks. Palestinians call an apartheid wall that carves up their land. Each side sees it through the lens of fear and faith, one protecting the chosen nation, the other imprisoning a people with divine claims of their own. The wall is not just concrete, it is theology disguised as architecture. Media also plays a role in embedding religious identities. During the Troubles, newspapers labeled people by religion even when the issue had nothing to do with faith. A man wasn't shot. A Protestant or a Catholic was shot. Every incident reinforced the division. Sermons, songs, and slogans echoed through communities on both sides, telling people what side of the line they belonged to. In Israel-Palestine, coverage is even more charged. International media often frames the conflict through religious lenses, even when the actual issue is legal, territorial, or humanitarian. Israeli politicians invoke Jewish history and biblical rights. Palestinian leaders invoke Islamic heritage and holy duty. Each speaks not only to their own people, but to a global audience that sees the conflict through faith-based narratives. Even education shapes how religion sustains conflict. In Northern Ireland, children attended separate schools, based on religion for generations. They learned separate histories, celebrated different holidays, commemorated different heroes. Integrated schooling was rare and controversial for most of the 20th century. In Israel-Palestine, children also grow up with narratives that rarely acknowledge the other side's pain or legitimacy. Israeli textbooks speak of exile, return, and survival. Palestinian textbooks speak of dispossession, occupation, and resistance. Religion seeps through these lessons, sometimes directly, sometimes subtly, framing identity as a path set in Scripture, not strategy. Yet somewhere beneath the slogans, murals, and holy texts lies a truth both conflicts share. People on both sides are tired. In Northern Ireland, that exhaustion eventually became stronger than the hatred. People who once marched with flags started marching to supermarkets in neighborhoods they once feared. But peace did not erase religion. Catholic and Protestant identities still exist. What changed was the willingness to kill for them. Israel and Palestine may not be at that stage yet. The pain is fresher, the stakes feel higher, and religion continues to frame the endgame as existential. But the Northern Ireland example shows that even wars branded with divine language can soften when communities realize that faith can survive compromise, but not endless funerals. To compare these wars properly, we must look deeper at how religious institutions themselves reacted to conflict. In Northern Ireland, the churches were not neutral bystanders. Catholic priests often stood with nationalist communities, visiting prisons where IRA members were held, delivering last rites at funerals of those killed in clashes, and sometimes even mediating between paramilitaries and the state. On the Protestant side, preachers in certain loyalist strongholds gave sermons that warned of cultural extinction if Catholics ever gained power. Religion acted as both comfort and justification. But even within those divisions, there were cracks. Some clergy began to preach reconciliation, though their voices were often drowned out by gunfire and mistrust. In later years, as the violence dragged on, more religious leaders stepped forward to speak of shared suffering, human dignity, and forgiveness. Even if their congregations resisted listening at first, the power of religion in Northern Ireland was not simply that it divided. It was that it could also be reclaimed to encourage peace, once communities were too exhausted to keep bleeding. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religious institutions carry even more political weight. In Israel, religious Zionists hold deep influence over debates around settlements, Jerusalem, and state policy. Some rabbis teach that giving up land is a sin against God's promise. Others argue that peace is also a Jewish commandment, and that coexistence is not a betrayal, but a moral necessity. Yet those moderate voices often struggle to break through the louder rhetoric of divine entitlement. Among Palestinians, religion is equally complex. Islamic clerics have long been central figures in resistance, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. Friday sermons often mobilize communities, not only in spiritual matters, but in shaping political consciousness. The language of resistance is frequently tied to religious duty. Yet within Islam, there are also clerics calling for coexistence, mutual recognition, and diplomacy, voices often overshadowed by the sound of rockets and sirens. Christian Palestinians, though fewer in number, add another layer of religious identity, reminding the world that Palestine is not only Muslim, but home to one of the oldest Christian communities on earth. This interplay between religion and leadership makes peace-building complicated. In Northern Ireland, political factions eventually reached a point where they could sit in the same room, not because they trusted each other, but because long war made them recognize there was no outright victory. In the Middle East, that moment has not fully come. The belief that land is divinely granted leaves little room for bargaining. Every compromise is seen by some as sacrilege, not strategy. Another striking comparison lies in how everyday people internalize the conflict through religious identity. In Northern Ireland during the Troubles, people could often tell someone's religion by their name, accent, school, uniform, or even football team. That meant danger could come simply by walking onto the wrong street at the wrong hour. Neighborhoods were segregated, shops were divided, and even hospitals had reputations for being Catholic or Protestant majority. Religion was not private. It was stitched into daily survival. In Israel-Palestine, the markers of identity are just as sharp. An Israeli Jewish family living in Jerusalem may speak Hebrew, observe Jewish holidays, and send their children to schools that align with their faith and nationality. A Palestinian family in Hebron, Gaza, or the West Bank may speak Arabic, pray at a local mosque, and remember stories passed down from grandparents who lived through displacement. Even those who are secular or less religious cannot escape belonging to an identity group marked by faith. You may not attend synagogue or mosque, but the world around you still treats you as part of that religious national fold. To understand how religion sustains conflict, you must also look at fear. Fear that the other group wants to erase you. Fear that compromise is just surrender in disguise. In Northern Ireland, Protestants worried they would be absorbed into a Catholic-controlled Ireland, where they'd be second-class citizens. Catholics feared another century of oppression under British rule. Religion amplified these fears because it tied them to history and destiny. Old battles, old injustices, old victories, all were remembered in sermons, songs, and schools. In Israel-Palestine, fear runs even deeper. Israelis fear another Holocaust, another expulsion, another war in which their existence is at stake. Palestinians fear permanent statelessness, the loss of their heritage, and the erasure of their homeland. For some Jews, the return to Zion is fulfillment of Scripture. For some Muslims, resistance is defense of a land blessed by God and tied to the legacy of the prophets. These motivations don't disappear with diplomacy. They endure long after handshakes and summits. But history also shows that even when religion shapes conflict, it does not always dictate the ending. In Northern Ireland, peace did not come because people started agreeing on theology. It came because the cost of war exceeded the fear of compromise. As communities buried their dead and watched generations grow up in barricaded streets, the idea of sharing power began to seem less dangerous than continuing the bloodshed. Religion still marked identity, but people began to imagine a future where being Catholic or Protestant didn't mean inheriting a lifetime of hostility. In Israel-Palestine, that tipping point has not yet arrived. Periods of negotiation have come and gone, from the Oslo Accords to attempts at ceasefire and statehood talks, but violence and mistrusts keep resetting the clock. The role of religion in this impasse is undeniable. When leaders speak of sacred land, holy promises, or divine protection, they are not merely invoking poetry. They are drawing red lines. Religious attachment makes territorial compromise emotionally and spiritually threatening. What might be a political concession in another region becomes, in this land, an existential crisis. Yet it is also true that not all religious narratives favor war. Some Israeli groups, particularly within more liberal Jewish circles, argue that Judaism commands justice and compassion, not domination. Some Palestinians argue that Islam teaches mercy, coexistence, and dignity, not endless conflict. Peace movements exist on both sides, often quiet, often overwhelmed by louder, more radical voices. But just as clergy in Northern Ireland gradually shifted public sentiment, there remains a possibility that religious leaders in Israel and Palestine could one day influence their societies toward reconciliation rather than resistance. One of the most powerful lessons from the Troubles is that peace did not require people to abandon their faith. It required them to stop weaponizing it. Catholics did not stop being Catholics. Protestants did not stop being Protestants. They stopped letting religious identity justify perpetual war. They built political frameworks that allowed both identities to exist without erasing each other. The Good Friday Agreement did not solve every issue, nor did it erase hatred overnight, but it proved that religion could remain part of identity without dictating violence. If something similar is ever to happen in Israel-Palestine, it will not come from trying to erase religion from public life, but from redefining its role. Faith must move from a tool of exclusion to a justification for coexistence. Just as the Bible and Christian tradition were once used to justify colonialism in Ireland, but later became sources of peace rhetoric, the Torah, Quran, and shared Abrahamic traditions could play a role in reshaping the future of the Holy Land. The same scriptures that contain stories of conquest also contain teachings of mercy, justice, and neighborly duty. When you look at the generational impact, you see another eerie similarity. In Northern Ireland, children grew up during the Troubles thinking that bombs, checkpoints, and discrimination were normal. They learned songs about martyrs, stories of betrayal, and warnings passed down like family heirlooms. It took decades after the peace agreement for those reflexes to fade, and even now, some divisions remain in thought and identity. In Israel-Palestine, generations have grown up under occupation, rocket fire, airstrikes, military drafts, and refugee camps. Children learn early who their enemies are supposed to be. They hear sermons, speeches, and stories about lost homes, holy claims, and promised lands. They do not need to read sacred texts to absorb religious identity. It is in the air, in the rituals, in the rhythm of daily life. Undoing that kind of conditioning is not a task for a single peace treaty. It is a task for generations willing to imagine a different fate. Perhaps the deepest question is this: does religion start these wars, or does it simply give existing conflicts a spiritual costume? In both Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine, politics, colonial history, nationalism, and economics all play major roles. But religion simplifies complexity. It gives two sides, a story in which they are chosen, threatened, justified. It turns land into destiny. It makes compromise look like sin and resistance look like duty. But the comparison also shows something else. Religion is not inherently a force of war. It is a force of meaning. In the hands of fear, it becomes a weapon. In the hands of courage, it becomes a bridge. Northern Ireland proved that. The question is whether Israel and Palestine will one day prove it too.